Hi, I'm Kevin Hildebrand. In this video, I'll talk about some ideas for playing Divine Service Setting 3 in Lutheran Service Book. This liturgical setting is very familiar to many Lutherans, and it's easy to take the playing of this service for granted. But if we take a closer look at our playing, we can improve our playing with care and creativity. Let's start with the beginning of the service and the Kyrie, where a small introduction would be helpful. Perhaps the first three chords. That gives us our opening key and tells the congregation it's time to sing. In the playing of this, a simple, quiet registration would be appropriate, and sometimes there's an unwritten tradition of having a little bit extra time or an extra beat in between each phrase, something like this. The Kyrie segues directly into the Gloria and Excelsis. Typically, the pastor will chant his part to intone this. Glory be to God on high. And typically he would do that unaccompanied. However, it would be appropriate, if necessary, to accompany that lightly on a very quiet registration using the cue notes that are provided in the musical score. When the congregation begins singing, "And on earth peace, goodwill toward men," of course, a fuller registration would be called for. One thing to watch and listen for that's unique in this setting is that it's really Anglican chant, kind of a psalm tone that's all written out. And we want to listen carefully when we come to the ends of the musical phrases, the cadences, to make sure that we're not dragging it out or rushing it, and also to help bring the congregation along with us. This is what I mean. If we sing, "And on earth peace, goodwill toward men," we can bring the congregation along without dragging at the ends of those phrases. Watch out that when we look at the notation isn't strict note values. Whole notes, 1, 2, 3, 4. Half notes, 1, 2, 1, 2. Instead, the notation is simply a placeholder for how long it takes to let that text happen in a natural way. All right? So that's one thing that we need to listen for as we are leading the singing of this canticle. One other thing that might be helpful in these reciting tones, like in the next phrase, "We praise thee, we bless thee, we worship thee." You'll notice we're starting a new chord each time we have the word we. We praise thee, we bless thee, we worship. It's not notated in the score to have a new chord on the we worship thee, but that's the way the congregation is singing it, starting a new phrase. So it may be helpful for us to replay that chord there also, like this. We praise thee, we bless thee, we worship thee. Do you hear how I replayed that chord on the we worship as a way to help lead the congregation? Sometimes there's a tradition in certain congregations of reducing the registration slightly when the text comes to "that takest away the sin of the world," and that's okay. Make sure that you increase the registration back to its full registration when we get back to "thou that sittest at the right hand," or "for thou only art holy," so you end the way you began. Now let's move over to the Alleluia verse. And again, a short introduction would be very helpful to make sure everyone in the congregation is ready to sing. Perhaps playing through the final Alleluia would be an appropriate introduction, and then launching into the Alleluia itself. A fuller registration would be called for here. The same procedure we would use if we're doing the second version of the Alleluia as well, the one in C major. Maybe something like this. One idea for these Alleluias is if your congregation hardly ever uses the other musical setting of the Alleluia, is perhaps find a way to start to implement that to add another bit of variety to that part of the liturgy that's already here in the book for you. Like the Alleluia verse, we want to have those gospel acclamations played on a full registration with a lot of clarity and precision, especially in the note values. And I think if we play that last chord for 4 beats and then release, that'll make it very clear for the congregation. Now let's move over to the offertory, the Create in Me. A short introduction will help the congregation know it's time to sing. Maybe the first and last phrases of this canticle. That was an idea we talked about in our video on hymn introductions by playing the first and last phrase. Maybe something like this. A simple registration that's not overpowering would be most appropriate here. Now let's move to the service of the sacrament, where we begin with these preface sentences. We have a dialogue between pastor and congregation, and one thing to listen for is how long are you holding that last chord. I think only 1 or 2 beats would be all that's required, so that the pastor can continue with his sentence, and then the congregation can sing theirs, and back and forth we go. Something like this. Or the next one, for example. 1, 2, off would be all that we need, so that the pastor then can continue with his part and have this dialogue back and forth between pastor and congregation. Following that, we have the Sanctus, and no introduction is necessary. Following the proper preface, you can just launch right into the playing and the singing of this canticle. And here's where you can have the fullest, biggest registration that you use, because this is the highest musical part of the liturgy. One thing to listen for in the Sanctus is how long are you holding those whole notes in the holy, holy. Listen to make sure that we have 4 full beats there. Maybe lift on beat 4, but don't cheat the duration of those whole notes. 1, 2, 3, lift. 1, 2, 3, lift. Another consideration is further on in the Sanctus when we have the repeated chords and repeated notes at blessed is he, blessed is he. I would suggest that we sustain those inner voices, the tenor and the alto. Otherwise, the playing of those chords could be too choppy. This is what I mean. If we simply separate all those chords at the blessed is he, we'll get this. And you hear how there's a little bit too much choppiness in there? If we sustain the inner voices of those repeated chords, we'll get a little bit more legato sound and still leading that rhythm with the outer voices repeating like this. A similar thing happens in the Agnus Dei, where we have repeated chords. Again, that practice of sustaining the inner voices would be very helpful to lead the singing, but still not have too choppy of a sound. This is what I mean. Did you hear that? At sin of the world. On those repeated chords, let's sustain the alto and tenor. One other thing to watch and listen for are the ends of the phrase, at sin of the world. Then it's followed by a rest. Make sure that we hold world for its full duration of 2 beats, and then the rest. Observe the rest. It's a built-in breath spot for the organ and the congregation. And don't cheat the note value or that rest every time that occurs in the canticle. One other thing to remember is if the pastor and the congregation are singing the Pax Domini, the peace of the Lord be with you always, Amen, it's not necessary to have any introduction for the Agnus Dei. You can go right from the Amen and continue to play the Agnus Dei maybe after a brief break. However, if the pastor and the congregation are speaking the peace of the Lord be with you always, Amen, you'll want to have some type of short introduction, maybe the first phrase of the Agnus Dei in order to prepare the congregation for singing. Following the Lord's Supper, we have the Nunc Dimittis, and after a short introduction, a full registration would be appropriate. And also, like the Gloria, listening to the congregation on these reciting chords, like, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart, so that we can help lead the tempo of that text in there. Like in the Gloria, it might be helpful to lift that last chord as we approach the next phrase when we sing the words, depart. It's not notated in the music that way, but if we play it that way, it will help go along with what the congregation is singing. Listen, this is what I mean. Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. Did you hear how there's a little bit of a lift? I put a new repeating of that chord at depart. Listen to that again. You may want to do that again further on in this canticle at which thou hast prepared, and have that same kind of procedure like this. The purpose of that is just to help lead that text and lead the singing so that the organ and congregation are singing and playing together. Those are some ideas to help you in your playing of this very familiar liturgical setting. Be sure to watch our other videos for more ideas with hymn and liturgy playing. Thanks for watching.